The tremendous effect that school closures and public health mandates are having on America's school children are becoming harder to ignore. In addition to falling behind in their academics, falling behind rather, children and teens are now increasingly suffering from mental health issues. In his morning newsletter, New York Times reporter David Leonhardt writes that the issues have been, quote, aggravated by the isolation and disruption of the pandemic. 3 medical groups, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, recently declared a national state of emergency in children's mental health. They cited dramatic increases in emergency department visits for all mental health emergencies. New York Times isn't the only outlet that seems to be getting the message. Over at CNN, Dr. Richard Besser acknowledged the lack of focus on the unintended consequences of COVID policy. Watch this.
What we've learned over the past 2 years is that there's significant risk keeping children out of school. Risk in terms of not just educational learning, but socialization and mental health and all kinds of things that are really, really important. And we had put the big emphasis over these past 2 years on reducing as much as possible the risk of infection. And with that, I don't think we paid enough attention to the risks to mental health by keeping kids out of school.
You don't say. For more on this, let me bring in the president of the Brownstone Institute, Jeffrey Tucker. Jeffrey, thank you for being with us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. And yes, I'm outraged too to listen to these comments. And we've learned that shutting down kids' schools can be bad for kids. We've learned that there's a psychological cost to massively disrupting people's lives and closing their schools and forcing them into Zoom classes. Who could have seen this coming? Who could have known this? Well, it was an outrage that this ever happened. The kids were at a vanishing low risk of COVID in the first place. The whole country was shut down, not just schools, for a pandemic that hadn't yet arrived. And here we are 2 years later with a genuine mass pandemic with sickness all over the country, exacerbated by the lockdowns and surrounded by astonishing carnage, profoundly affecting the children more than anybody else. So this is a moral outrage, and we're going to be paying a price for this for decades hence.
Given the realities of the data, and you alluded to some of it there, children are at very, very low risk, not only of serious disease themselves. In fact, it's generally the case they don't even know they have the disease because it's so minor, particularly for those under the age of 12. But what is the argument now? I mean, when the teachers' unions are, as they currently are, for everyone watching this, in places like New York and Chicago and Detroit, and I'm sure you'll see more of this in Los Angeles, advocating for shutdowns that they say will be weeks, but who knows, of course. Is there even a good faith argument to be made at this point? I mean, how could we be at this place, Jeffrey, 2 years in?
Well, at the very outset of the pandemic, there was a perception that somehow kids were going to be the super spreaders. And they believed this from their models that, were 15 years out of date. And you can look at and see the models by the Glasses and Carter Meacher and the rest of these people. They were convinced that the way disease spreads is through classrooms and school buses, and so that was their first target, was to shut down the schools. That they paid no attention to the data, nothing about the particulars of COVID, which is a very bad virus. But fortunately and mercifully, it spared children, unlike 1918, or for that matter, unlike 67, 68, or 57, 58. So, we should have known this, but instead we targeted the schools, shut them all down, thinking that this was going to somehow stop the pandemic. I don't know what the effect of the school shutdowns were on the spread of the virus, but it doesn't matter. Here we are 2 years in, and the virus is everywhere. There were 1 million infections just over the last couple of days in the United States, right? So 2 years in, we're still dealing with this stuff. Everybody's going to get COVID, and people are going to acquire their immunities. So in other words, this pandemic ends exactly the way competent epidemiologists always predicted.